Good evening and welcome to Wide Angle. I'm Brendan Fallon. Tonight we're going to talk about two topics. Firstly, we're going to look at how senior Republicans have turned against the president and how a Trump versus Washington swamp showdown could be imminent. In terms of our second topic tonight, we talked last time about how traces of tyranny are appearing in the kind of threats, harassment, and intimidation being used to silence witnesses to the election fraud. In a similar vein, for our second topic tonight, we'll look at what happens when this type of tyranny really takes hold. We're going to be looking at Hong Kong, where the Chinese Communist Party intensified its control over the city and has been ruthlessly stifling the voices of its people. Before we get started, if you enjoy our channel, please remember to like, subscribe, and share with your family and friends. Okay, let's get started. December 14th was the day the U.S. Electoral College voted for the president and vice president, and each elector in the Electoral College of each state gave their vote. 306 votes were cast for Biden and 232 for President Trump. The result will be submitted to Congress for final review and certification on January 6th. However, some states' Republican caucuses have urgently introduced their own electors and voted for Trump and Pence, resulting in a unique scenario of one state, two sets of results. In the end, a total of 7 state Republican caucuses released their own electoral votes. Yet these Republican electoral votes are not valid until the Supreme Court rules that a state's original vote is invalid and must be withdrawn. If this happens, then the Republican version of the vote will have a chance of being submitted to Congress for review and certification. It's important to remember, though, that the Republican Party's electors in these 7 states are only electors within the caucus, instead of being electors elected through the state legislature. The U.S. Constitution clearly states in Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2, that, quote, each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature therefore may direct a number of electors. In other words, only the state legislatures have the power to elect electors to represent the state to elect the president. Since the Republican Party's electoral votes in these 7 states are not certified by the state legislatures, they have no practical validity. As a result, some people, including the governor of Florida and TV personalities, have called on the GOP in the disputed states to arrange a new electoral college elected by the state legislature as soon as possible to vote for President Trump. But the Republican leaders of the state legislatures in the disputed states have said they have no intention of re-electing the electors at this time. After all, if they did, though it may seem constitutionally defensible, it would likely trigger strong protests from Democratic supporters and leave these legislators in an adverse position. In other words, by the way of a second set of electors to replace the Democratic electors, the chances of winning seems to be very slim at the moment. Therefore, the main hope for the Trump camp is the Congress battle. That is, on January 6th, if the Congress rejects the votes of a few disputed states and reduces Biden's vote to less than 270, it will be up to the Congress to elect the president. Republican Congressman for Alabama, Mo Brooks, who's considered a top Congress warrior by many, has been promoting this pathway. If neither Biden or President Trump win more than half of the vote, it will trigger the 12th Amendment to the Constitution and allow Congress to elect the president instead. Brooks has repeatedly explained this strategy in the media over the past 2 days and has called on like-minded senators and representatives to join him. President Trump has signaled his approval of this approach. In fact, he retweeted Brooks-related Fox interview on Twitter. However, this approach also comes with its difficulties, and I'm going to offer a bit of an explainer now to go into the details of that. The first difficulty is that Brooks has to find at least one senator willing to join him in taking this stance. By challenging the electors' vote in certain states, they would trigger the 12th Amendment mechanism. But if no senator is willing to step forward, this strategy becomes untenable. The second difficulty relates to the process that happens if the mechanism is triggered. In this case, the House of Representatives and the Senate will have separate internal discussions whereby each chamber will have 2 hours to vote on this issue. Then, only if both chambers agree to reject a state's results will the state's electoral vote be removed. However, if only one of the two chambers rejects it and the other does not, the vote will remain valid, which means the challenge will not work. So the technical threshold for a Congress battle is actually quite high. But the most recent, even bigger challenge is that Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell officially recognized Biden as the president-elect on December 15th, and he called on the GOP not to object congressional certification of the Electoral College vote on January 6th. He also warned GOP senators not to join the Republican House of Representatives' challenge to the electoral vote. Otherwise, it would put, quote, fellow GOP senators in a bad position. He added that such an approach, quote, isn't in the best interest of everybody. So it seems as though McConnell has resigned himself to the idea that the election result is beyond reversal. Accordingly, he seems to be wholeheartedly endorsing the Biden victory and encouraging his Republican cohorts to do the same and effectively abandon Trump. Incidentally, McConnell's wife, Elaine Chao, is the former Department of Transportation Secretary, whose family has a strong relationship with the top of the Chinese Communist Party. Her father is a schoolmate of Jiang Zemin, the former leader of the Chinese Communist Party. So McConnell's public statement has added another dimension of difficulty to Representative Brooks' planned congressional battle. Without any senators joining and supporting, Brooks will be left alone. Therefore, President Trump now has fewer options left to expose the truth of this election and to investigate what is very possibly treason. Maybe this leaves the use of presidential prerogative power as the only potent option. That is, in order to prevent the US constitutional democracy from drowning in this overwhelming election fraud and coup, President Trump needs to release clear evidence of the crime to charge the insurgents, declare a national emergency, impose limited martial law, activate the counterinsurgency at the same time, and use military forces to intervene in the investigation and enforcement. Moreover, President Trump must take action as soon as possible prior to January 6th, the day the Congress counts the electoral votes. Because once Congress certifies the election results, it is equivalent to certifying the bipartisan public opinion. At that time, if President Trump wants to come back to use the presidential prerogative power to intervene, it won't be viewed as being as legitimate, and very likely it will lead to a huge backlash and resistance, putting him in a much more unfavorable position. Then, will President Trump use his presidential prerogative power to investigate the fraud and defend American constitutional democracy? I think it's very possible, because it seems that all other options are rapidly becoming unfeasible, and the court system hard to count on. Moreover, as we've talked about in our last episode, there's at least 6 specific signals showing President Trump may already be arranging this atomic-level military option, which includes Signal 1, which was the 2018 declaration of a national emergency, which is still in effect, Signal 2, Trump's replacement of the Secretary of Defense, Signal 3, the 82nd Airborne Division revealing the storm is coming, Signal 4, the election being classified by Trump as a coup and a crime, Signal 5, Trump choosing to visit West Point for the annual Navy-Army football game despite all the pressure he's under because of the election situation at the moment, and Signal 6, the mysterious code word that appeared on one of the helicopters transporting Trump and the crew to the Navy-Army football game. In other words, President Trump is very likely preparing a formal showdown with the forces of the deep state. And the deep state surely has its own armed forces, so a military fight may be coming between the two sides. So when would President Trump officially use his presidential prerogative power? My guess is that it will be soon after the release of the Director of National Intelligence's report to the President to tell him if there's been foreign interference in the election. The evidence in this report could add legitimacy to the President's decision to enact prerogative power. Now that's assuming that this report is still released as planned. because the Office of the Director of National Intelligence has just said that its report will not be finished by the December 18th deadline. Is this another instance of government officials adding obstacles to Trump's path? The significant delay of the report could weaken Trump's public standing to use his prerogative powers, especially if he's relying on it to provide crucial evidence of foreign interference in the election. At the same time, we know the Trump camp to be highly determined and resilient in the face of continual setbacks, and it's not to rule out that they have more hard-hitting evidence that they just haven't released yet. Curiously, when President Trump visited West Point to watch the Navy and Army football game on December 12th, he was accompanied by Acting Secretary of Defense Chris Miller, Chief of Staff of the Army James McInville, and Director of National Intelligence John Ratcliffe. The presence of these four giants at the same time at West Point could signal preparation for concerted military action. Before we go on, let's take a moment to look at a provocative cartoon. This one really doesn't need much explanation. In the picture, Uncle Sam, representing the United States, is pinned to the ground by a thumb. Biden is lying on top of him, putting up the thumb and shouting, "Thumbs up for China." If we look to the upper left, we can see that the big brown hand is the Chinese Communist Party. This cartoon mocks the fact that Biden becomes the president-elect of the United States by cheating with the help of the Chinese Communist Party. But how long can Biden be the president-elect? Can he really take office? For the second half of our episode tonight, we'd like to take a slight departure from American politics and talk about recent developments in Hong Kong. In short, since this year, the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, has not only taken advantage of the COVID-19 crisis to target Hong Kong, but also tried to take advantage of the US election controversy to occupy Hong Kong. With all eyes on the US election, the CCP has taken the opportunity to increase its stranglehold on Hong Kong in what looks like an effort to silence all dissenting voices. In my opinion, the CCP is now adopting a strategy of, quote, full-range silencing of Hong Kong, trying to eliminate any opposition to the CCP as soon as possible. Their approach can be roughly classified into four methods. Method 1 is to stifle voices in the Legislative Council, forcing Democrats to resign en masse in order to monopolize legislative power. On November 11th, the Chinese Communist Party's parliament made a decision to disqualify pro-democracy lawmakers from its legislature, including Alvin Yeung and Dennis Kwok from the pro-democracy camp. They were disqualified on the charge that they were involved in or promoting or supporting Hong Kong independence, refusing to recognize the CCP's sovereignty over Hong Kong, and colluding with foreign forces in the affairs of the Special Administrative Region of China. Later that day, all members of the Legislative Council from the Democratic camp announced that they would resign en masse and retreat together. In other words, until the Legislative Council is re-elected next September, there will be no more voices from the Democratic camp. In fact, over the past 2 years, the CCP and the Hong Kong government have created innumerable obstacles and unreasonably suppressed the pan-democratic legislators, with the real purpose of reducing or eliminating the opposition voices in the Legislative Council. In this way, at least for the next 9 months, the pro-Beijing camp will dominate the Legislative Council and monopolize legislative power. This enables the Chinese Communist Party to promote all kinds of laws that are conducive to Beijing's control over Hong Kong, erasing the spirit of freedom and democratic legislation and universal values inherited from the British Hong Kong era. The consequence is that Hong Kong will become more mainlandized in terms of its legal system and life. Method 2 is to stifle voices in social movements. On August 23, 2020, 12 Hong Kong residents were captured by the Chinese Marine Police at sea and sent directly to the Yantian Detention Center in Shenzhen. They had participated in the Anti-Extradition Law Amendment Bill movement and were headed for Taiwan to escape from danger. After over 110 days, the CCP has still not publicly revealed any details of their condition or whether they are alive or dead. Instead of allowing the families and lawyers to meet with the 12 Hong Kongers, the CCP is suspected to have written family letters on behalf of the 12 Hong Kongers and sent the letters back to Hong Kong. The letters are to the tune that the detainees have examined their behaviors and want their families to stop any attempts to rescue them. Anyone who has some understanding of the CCP's persecution of human rights knows that those letters or videos are typical tricks that the CCP plays to rationalize the persecution of human rights. To force the victims to plead guilty, the CCP creates letters and videos of victims expressing introspection, repentance, and confession, as well as asking their family members to stop making trouble. Essentially, through legislative weapons, these Chinese Communist Party methods aim to spread fear among Hong Kongers, forcing them to stop participation in social movements, so that the CCP can effectively silence the social movement. The CCP is relying on these terrorist methods, like jailing people in the mainland and holding secret trials to eliminate any potential social resistance. Method 3 of silencing the voices of Hong Kongers is to stifle voices on campuses, to destroy young people's will to resist, and to brainwash the next generation. On December 2nd, 3 key members of the pro-democracy group Demosisto, Joshua Wong, Agnes Chow, and Ivan Lam, were sentenced to jail over charges related to their protest activism last June, receiving 7 to 13.5 months behind bars. In particular, Agnes Chow had no criminal record, and the case happened before the implementation of the Hong Kong security law, but she was still sentenced to 10 months in prison. This prompted criticism that the sentence was too harsh, and even drew the scrutiny of some Japanese media. In fact, the Chinese Communist Party has deliberately targeted these high-profile young student activists with heavy sentences in order to intimidate and warn Hong Kong's young people and students. Beijing wants to force this group of young people that have shown so much courage and commitment to holding on to their freedoms to silence themselves and physically and psychologically submit to the Chinese Communist Party. At the same time, the Chinese Communist Party also vigorously promotes its so-called patriotic education to brainwash young Hong Kongers, such as with its slogans of love of party and love of country are one and the same, and no distinction between the CCP and the country. The CCP wants them to be completely assimilated to the mainland culture and to not start another anti-extradition law amendment bill movement. Method 4 is to stifle voices in the media to eliminate freedom of speech, leaving only Beijing propaganda. Media has always been the most important propaganda weapon for the Chinese Communist Party, whereas in free societies, freedom of thought, speech, and action are in part enabled through a free and open press. Therefore, the CCP has always fixated on restricting freedom of speech in Hong Kong. The arrest of the founder of Next Media, Jimmy Lai, is one of the best examples. Jimmy Lai was first charged with fraud on December 3rd, and then last week, the police charged him with collusion with a foreign country under the Hong Kong security law. Jimmy Lai is still being held in prison. As you know, Next Digital is well known for its opposition to the Chinese Communist Party, and its subsidiary company, Apple Daily, faced a major police search in August. Now, Jimmy Lai is in jail. This injustice will certainly have a suppressing and silencing impact on the freedom of the press and the courage of the media in Hong Kong. In particular, at the end of August, the Hong Kong police launched a major arrest campaign in response to last year's Yuen Long attack. However, the police targeted the victims of the attack instead of the white-clad gangsters who perpetrated it. The police tried to reverse narratives by portraying the protesters during the anti-extradition bill movement as the aggressors, when in fact the protesters were frequently just trying to protect themselves from gang-type assaults. The police's remarks were a public challenge to the conscience and moral values of Hong Kong people. As a result, many media outlets took the initiative to counter-strike the police by restoring the truth and history of the Yuen Long incident in detail. They revealed that the police collaborated with the armed gang members at the scene. These truthful reports made the police and the pro-communist media embarrassed and unable to fight back. This made it difficult for the Beijing and Hong Kong governments to cover the event with lies and manipulate the public's thinking. Beijing was anxious to take action against the Hong Kong media. Therefore, in order to warn others, Jimmy Lai and his Next Digital were the first to be hit. From a broader perspective, the recent moves by the Chinese Communist Party and the Hong Kong government are in fact an orderly terrorist attack on Hong Kong, from the legislative power and suffrage to civil liberty. Obviously, the CCP is eager to wipe out the ideological, operational, and legal foundations of Hong Kongers for pursuing freedom and democracy as soon as possible, before the eve of the centennial of the CCP in 2021. To conclude, the Chinese Communist Party has recently taken advantage of the internal chaos of the US election to accelerate the suppression of all voices of Hong Kong people fighting against the CCP. There are 4 aspects to this. The first is to stifle voices in the Legislative Council, forcing Democrats to resign en masse in order to monopolize legislative power. The second is to stifle voices in social movements, using methods like imprisoning people and holding secret trials to effect rule by terror in Hong Kong. Thirdly, the Chinese Communist Party is attempting to stifle voices on campuses to destroy young people's will to resist and to brainwash the next generation. Fourthly, they're stifling voices in the media to replace free press with pro-Beijing propaganda to wipe out freedom of speech. Hong Kong has unfortunately become a powerful illustration of how crucial it is to stand up against tyranny and safeguard our freedoms while we're still able to. Thank you for watching tonight. If you enjoy our channel, please remember to like and subscribe and share with your family and friends. We'll see you next time.